Did Bethesda already start teasing Fallout 5? Bethesda likes to do this thing with their games where they tease the next game in the previous one. So for example, if we go back to Fallout 3, there was a particularly heavy-handed instance of this. The entire Replicated Man questline is basically a giant teaser for Fallout 4. It involves an escaped android, aka a synth that is quite literally escaped from Commonwealth, members of the Railroad actually coming to the Capital Wasteland to try and help the synth, and a member of the Institute coming to try and recapture him. Fallout 4, of course, had that very famous opening.
Since debuting Vault 76 last year, in honor of America's tercentenary, Vault-Tec continues to expand with plans for well over 100 vaults around the country.
And even in the Mothership Zeta DLC, we could find a terminal entry around Vault 76, all of this of course being a big teaser for Fallout 76. And even to a lesser degree, some of the characters in Fallout 76 remark how they are from the pit.
This sure is better than dealing with the fanatics at the pit.
The first off-map DLC location we will be going to in that game. So Bethesda clearly likes to leave either a large or relatively small teaser for what they plan to do next. This didn't happen with New Vegas, as you're probably wondering, largely because we know from interviews the location of New Vegas was pitched by Obsidian, so it wasn't actually chosen by Bethesda. And even New Vegas actually mentioned parts of the Commonwealth. And even with some of these, there's a pretty big gap. Like if you compare the Fallout 3 mentions to the Fallout 4 release, there is a 7-year window in between those two. Bethesda clearly knew ahead of time when making the base game of Fallout 3 that there was at least plans or some theories as to where to go next. So as I talked about in a recent video, we don't know exactly when Fallout 5 or even the next Fallout spin-off game is coming. But that said, what we do know is that based on Bethesda's track record, it is incredibly likely that we already have a mention or a slight tease as to the location of that game. And in this video, I want to go through some of the very probable ones, as there are actually several that make a lot of sense, have been mentioned numerous times, and even have some supporting evidence from Bethesda or quotes by them to suggest it could be the next Fallout game's location. Looking at Fallout 76 in general, things get a bit tricky because, as I mentioned before, the game does have its expeditions, off-map expansions coming anyway, so it's kind of hard to gauge. Are these teasers for expeditions or teasers for a future Fallout title? Fallout 76 features a ton of mentions of the Commonwealth and even Nuka World, but also several for Fallout 3's Capital Wasteland, which we'll almost certainly return to in some of the expeditions following the pit. One of the places that definitely gets fans excited for that we do see mentioned is some kind of southern-based Fallout. With the Shanghai Sally story in Fallout 76, we saw mentions of several regions in the south, notably Flagstaff, Arizona, but perhaps even more exciting, El Paso, Texas. A Fallout Lone Star has long been requested, and that definitely could be possible, but I think there's an even better alternative. And really, I have 3 locations in mind that have numerous mentions and I think could make a lot of sense for the next Fallout game. The first of which is actually just Chicago. So Chicago's a pretty interesting one in that it actually has a fairly substantial mention in basically every 3D Fallout game. We hear how the Enclave has an outpost there.
If you're listening to this log from one of our Enclave outposts in Chicago, give this unit whatever repairs it needs so it can continue to Navarro.
Nick Valentine from Fallout 4 actually was transferred from Chicago. That's originally where he was stationed. We know that a Brotherhood of Steel airship actually crashed there and formed a Chicago chapter. And even in Fallout 76, the ally Sophia was originally from Chicago. And it's even just a few. There are many more mentions of Chicago from all of the various Fallout games, typically a terminal entry, a line of dialogue, or even a bit of a backstory here or there. And even fans have taken things so far as to actually create a map of Chicago or what it could look like in a Fallout game, although this does definitely go outside of the borders a bit. But one of the other pretty interesting things about a Chicago Fallout is it actually does provide a really nice slate for where Bethesda could take it, or even a potential other company. We don't inherently know if Bethesda is making the next Fallout game with how busy they're going to be with the Elder Scrolls and Starfield. What we do know is that there are Brotherhood of Steel members here as well as Enclave members, but technically this is actually a new version of the Brotherhood of Steel, tentatively named the Eastern Brotherhood of Steel, though this lore hasn't been super fleshed out. Basically, there was a Brotherhood airship traveling to Chicago to take down mutants. Actually, there are a ton of airships, many ended up crashing and getting destroyed, but one managed to crash land and survive. Following this, an Eastern chapter of the Brotherhood of Steel was established fairly early on and fought off the mutants, but also cut off communication to the greater Brotherhood command. They kind of went rogue and established their own chapter chapter in Chicago, and although we know that happened, we don't know much else about them at all. What their ideology actually is, why they cut off communication, or how well established they even are. We just know and have seen it reinforced from even the more modern Fallouts that they are still there, existing, and doing something. It's a similar tale with the Enclave. You have that classic Brotherhood of Steel and Enclave presence, but we don't really know the size of the Enclave force, what their goals or attention actually is in Chicago, or anything like that. Chicago could provide a lot of interesting opportunities for the franchise overall, being the most Midwest out of any of the Fallouts, and also potentially a winter-based Fallout. It doesn't inherently have to be one, but Chicago, of course, definitely gets pretty cold, and it definitely could be a unique opportunity for Bethesda to introduce mechanics around that. Although I would argue, out of the top 3 candidates, I think Chicago is actually the least likely out of the 3, because we don't have much supporting evidence from Bethesda, just those in-game mentions, which there are a plentiful amount of over the years. Alternatively, we do have New York. For the longest time, there was this rather odd narrative by the Fallout community that New York was in fact a crater. This, of course, isn't the case. It is not established in the lore what happened to New York exactly. We know it was hit by nukes, but most of the cities that Fallout games take place in were hit by nukes, and obviously many still exist and stand. And this too has mentions in nearly all of the Fallout games, though it's not really as surprising considering just how large and how much of a presence New York has on the entire United States. And some of these mentions were much lighter, like a Boston versus New York rivalry mentioned in Fallout 4. And there's even an article in 76 about a woman's lunatic asylum based in New York. Mothership Zeta probably had the most substantial mention, with a character on Mothership Zeta being abducted from New York. But one of the big reasons I think this is more likely than Chicago is we actually heard how Bethesda was planning to do a Fallout 4 New York before they settled on Boston.
The first thing is for us is figure out where the hell is this game set. And it wasn't Boston originally. So it was set somewhere else, and I still have a design doc in my desk, original design doc. And in that design doc, the one holdover is the character of Nick Valentine was conceived even way back then. He was like the first character they came up with.
Emma's design doc focusing on a New York-based Fallout was one idea that the leads were floating around.
One of the big reasons I could see New York being scrapped initially for Fallout 4 is actually the tech just wasn't there. Whether it be the engine or the consoles themselves, we see how hard it is to get 60 FPS in downtown Boston. Downtown New York would likely be a lot larger, a lot more built up, a lot denser if they were going to truly do it justice, and maybe they were just like, hey, let's put this one in the back burner and wait till technology catches up for us to create a more proper and true to form post-apocalyptic New York City. One of the other interesting opportunities with New York is we know next to nothing about it. It was hit by nukes to some degree, but otherwise there's really almost no official lore. There's some mentions in the Fallout Bible, but those aren't canon. One thing that could be canon is on the Pridwin, several members mentioned seeing these tall buildings with mutants climbing all about them. The Pridwin likely passed over New York, so that could be a reference to New York, but they're just saying tall buildings. That could be in reference to a couple of the cities it passed over, plus there being mutants in a downtown Fallout location really isn't that crazy. So in turn, New York almost acts as a completely blank slate for a Fallout title. Bethesda could almost do whatever they want with the location outside of making it have been nuked somewhat, giving the opportunity for totally new factions or new and interesting ways to reintegrate old ones. Plus again, who wouldn't just absolutely love the ability to explore a post-apocalyptic New York? That would really be a truly memorable urban Fallout game. But then we have what I would say is the most likely next location for a Fallout game, and that is San Francisco. This would right off the bat be a big departure from Bethesda in multiple ways. On one hand, they actually are making a game on the West Coast. Bethesda has never done that. They've kind of avoided the West Coast to leave that lore intact, establishing their own lore on the East Coast, but also unique in that we did partially get to visit San Francisco in Fallout 2. A Bethesda Fallout game has never really revisited a location a second time, at least until Fallout 76's DLCs, and those are still upcoming. But at the same time, there's a lot of references and very heavy-handed references to San Francisco. You probably remember the memory sequence during Fallout 4. Kellogg used to live in San Francisco. You get a full-on display of the Golden Gate Bridge. Further, a fairly major plot point at one segment of the game is trying to find his San Francisco sunlights. Even more notable, in Nuka World, the Hubologist actually make an appearance. The Hubologists were originally originally introduced in San Fran in Fallout 2. To me, it definitely felt pretty surprising and just kind of an interesting choice to take a faction that we only experienced in San Francisco and place them in Nuka World on the other side of the country. To a lesser degree, in Fallout 76, there are of course many mentions of California, whether it be Lost Hills or Mariposa military base. Mariposa in particular is quite close to San Francisco, that being where the Brotherhood of Steel were founded and created. And more explicitly, there actually is the mention of San Francisco in a holotape in Fallout 76 as somebody comparing West Virginia to San Francisco. Another one that just kind of came out of left field with Fallout 4's Creation Club, they actually did release she paints created by Bethesda. These being skins for both armors and weapons that actually came back in Fallout 76 for Nuclear Winter. That was another one that just kind of came out of left field. Not many players knew who the she were. They appeared in Fallout 2 to a heavy presence in San Francisco and then just came back in Fallout 4 for a mini DLC in Creation Club. But what is perhaps one of the biggest indicators that Bethesda has some kind of plan for San Francisco is during the development of Fallout New Vegas, Bethesda actually asked Obsidian to remove a line saying San Francisco was completely destroyed after the events of Fallout 2.
They could place this game anywhere. In fact, at one stage they had asked Obsidian to remove a line in New Vegas about San Francisco being totally wiped off the map. They wanted the Bay Area to at least be an option for future games.
This in turn keeping San Francisco open for a future Fallout title. So taking that all together is actually pretty interesting. The major contribution with the line removal happened all the way back in 2010, 2011, but then of course San Francisco got a ton of representation in Fallout 4 and even Fallout 4 DLC. And then we even still see some mentions of the region in Fallout 76 and even explicit mentions with Fallout 76's base game. As I mentioned before, a San Francisco Fallout would be an interesting one in that we have already been there. There actually is a good amount of existing lore. When we see San Francisco in Fallout 2, it is heavily controlled by the She, almost being a Institute-esque faction, but of course the She did it before the Institute. During the Great War, there was a Chinese submarine that crash landed off the coast of San Francisco. These people then took up refuge on land and later turned into the She, and the people we encounter in Fallout 2 are the descendants of those original submarine members. They're this largely recluse group that are extremely advanced technologically, even advancing some of the technologies that were available before the Great War, and really just trying to stay out of the local politics, doing their own thing. Two of the other factions that would likely make an appearance, we also see the West Coast Brotherhood of Steel during this, although at the time of Fallout 2, it's just one guy in a bunker. Perhaps they're a bit bigger at the time of Fallout 5, and much of the surrounding region in California is controlled by the NCR, so they would almost certainly have to have a fairly major presence. But also, of course, as I mentioned before, the Hubologists are also based around this area, so we could see even them come back yet again. One of the big counterpoints to San Francisco being the location of the next game is, what if a lot of this was just a nod to an older Fallout game? It was kind of a throwback by Bethesda for those fans of the OG Fallouts, not actually a tease as to what's next. And although sure, that could make sense, it also begs the question, then why did they ask Obsidian to not blow up San Francisco if they had no plans for it? The combination of those two facts alone makes me feel pretty strongly that at some point we're going to a San Francisco Fallout, which is really exciting. I'm definitely excited to see what they do with that location, how they expand the lore. But at the end of the day, whether the next Fallout is Fallout 5 or even perhaps more likely some kind of spin-off title, there also is a lot of potential of just a random name drop here or there. There are plenty of big locations that have mentions in Fallout 76 just in a singular line. Whether it be Toronto, Detroit, or Seattle, we could find all of them mentioned in the game. It just might literally be one line of dialogue or one terminal line. All of those locations seem pretty plausible. I just think between New York, Chicago, and San Francisco, they have the most going for them. An interesting future I could see for the Fallout franchise is the next Fallout game is likely at least 5 years away at this point. Even that just kind of pulling a number out of nowhere. But we know we are visiting other Fallout locations even sooner with Fallout 76's expeditions. It really seems like this is the future of that game for Bethesda. It's how they're going to be doing a lot of that DLC content going forward. Of course, we're hitting the pit initially, but depending on how many of these they actually pump out a year, we could be very quickly covering a lot of the continental US or even further. If they do 2 a year and the next Fallout game's 5 years away, that could be 10 locations we visit in the time before the next Fallout game. So one way or another, we are likely going to be seeing more Fallout places explored, the lore expanded, and maybe maybe even more references and clues as to where Fallout 5 is taking place. If Bethesda mentions San Francisco again in any of these Fallout 76 DLCs, I will be definitely paying close attention. With that said, hopefully you guys found this one informative. I definitely think there's an extremely high likelihood the location of this next game has been mentioned somewhere, but obviously we might be very far off from actually knowing it definitively. With that said, as always, again, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you found this video informative, and I hope to see you all next time. Later.
You got guts and determination. It's admirable.